Damn, I don't have an intro. So I've got some upcoming videos that I've been cooking up. Kind of been slacking on them, not gonna lie. But in the meantime, I've decided to try a different, more loosely scripted video format. Something a bit easy to just edit and ramble on about. Basically just to get something out there, let you know that this channel isn't dead. And long story short, today I'm gonna be making a tier list on From Software games. Sorry if this video ends up being a bit messy and rambly. I'm just kind of trying something new here, seeing where things go. But anyways, the soulsbornekiroring series is a game franchise that I probably have the most experience in, or at least the one I'd be able to most easily talk about in some sort of substantial way. I've played all of these games many times over, some more than others, but I kind of went back and replayed all of them recently just to refresh my memory on all of them, make sure my thoughts on these games are as fresh as possible. Also recently finished Shadows of the Erdtree, so the timing just feels right, And yeah, without beating around the bushes any further, here's my From Software tier list. Okay, go. Starting with Demon Souls. I feel like the general consensus around Demon Souls is to rank it kind of around the bottom of the FromSoft pantheon for a few reasons, I guess. A lot of which kind of mostly due to it just kind of being the first of its kind. Because of that, the quality of life quite isn't there. It has a lot of really horribly dated mechanics, like the equip load management shit. It's not as streamlined as the future games would be. It feels like a lot of the design philosophies behind Demon Souls also died out as the series continued to go on. So, people kind of pay their respects to Ankh for kickstarting the whole series, but a lot of modern fans, I feel, aren't very favorable towards the game. But personally, and call me a contrarian, I think, well, I should specify I have not played the remake. I'm strictly talking about the original. But even then, I think Demon Souls is kind of godlike. We're starting off strong here. Now hear me out. Allow me to allow me to glaze for a little bit. I think what makes Demon Souls so great and age so gracefully is just how unique it is. And this is definitely a double-edged sword. When you throw a bunch of things at the wall, a lot of things just aren't gonna stick and will miss the mark entirely. And I'll kind of expand upon this later. FromSoft feels like they've lost a really important philosophy that made me fall in love with going back to their older games. That being to create an interesting and memorable experience above all else. The difficulty and the other things that the series would become notorious for are kind of just byproducts of this philosophy, and nowhere is this nearly as evident as in Demon Souls. I mean, the game just does a complete 180 on conventional game design in one of the most hand-holdy eras of gaming, mind you. It gave you that trust as a player to navigate the world in a really conscious and involved way, as if you were really there and had to actually think about the decisions you were making. And it's complemented with, in my opinion, FromSoft's best level design individually, bar for bar. Each level in each area feels so satisfying to explore, because there are in-universe logistical reasons as to why it would be laid out in the way that it is. A shortcut in the level's design for one of those areas feels like it has an actual in-universe reason to exist beyond player convenience. It doesn't feel overly gamey, and that adds a lot to the immersion and memorability of the game. Not to mention the art direction and the soundtrack echo all of these previously mentioned sentiments. No other game really looks or sounds like Demon Souls. It's so minimal, but it's just oozing with a thick mood and atmosphere. And it just has this unmatched vibe from any other game. The bosses, they're all super different from one another. No doubt has the widest boss variety of any of these games, and it kind of makes them the antithesis of modern FromSoft bosses. There aren't too many 1v1 humanoid type fights. It's mostly comprised of these super weird and interesting and unique bosses in a way that feel like they take more advantage of the Soulsborne formula. There's a lot more to most of these bosses than hit, dodge, heal. And again, this is a double-edged sword because with how experimental Demon Souls is, you're kind of bound to have some misses like Dragon God, you know. Low key might be worse than Bed of Chaos, but we're not ready for that conversation. But I can't help but have so much respect for FromSoft really being willing to disregard conventional game design in service of making a unique and memorable experience. A lot of my favorite moments in all of gaming are from Demon's Souls, going against the grain and not designing the game in a way that you're supposed to, not pandering to any preconceived expectations. World Tendency is an example of how this experimentation also exists within the mechanics. Like, what other game changes the world based on how you interact with it? What other game will punish you for dying repeatedly or lock certain NPC and items to a pure black or pure white world tendency? It's not the type of thing you're supposed to put in your game to make it more fun or accessible, but it makes it so much more interesting and interactive and just adds so much to the game, in my opinion, and I love it. Alright, enough yapping. Long story short, Demon's Souls, one of the most experimental and unique games probably ever, and even within its own series, these qualities, while being hit or miss, I think have aged remarkably well. The execution of its unique ideas is incredible and completely distinguishes itself from any other game, let alone in its own series. It's a game that breaks the form in a truly one-of-a-kind way. I'm putting it straight to S tier. Now, I know I just went on a huge glaze for Demon's Souls, but the glazing streak is going to continue because we got Dark Souls 1. Oh boy, yeah, all bias included, Dark Souls 1 is just my second favorite game, period, and my favorite single player game ever. It's kind of hard to properly put into words how much this game means to me, so bear with me for a bit. But I was in a really bad place when I first played Dark Souls 1, and I don't know what it was about the game exactly that made me feel this way, but something about the world of Lordran just completely entranced me. The first playthrough of Dark Souls 1 didn't even feel like a video game for me. It was just a completely separate world that I was totally immersed in. The world just felt so real, so lived in, and the way it was all interconnected was just so mind-blowing to me. I think what stuck with me the most was a general theme that is kind of the backbone of all of these games, that being perseverance. The overwhelming sense of triumph you feel overcoming a great challenge is the most commonly shared feeling among all of these games, I would say. And to me, exploring this hopeless, dying world of Lordran where your existence is so minimal and the universe feels completely indifferent to you, and finding these moments of triumph and finding your own strength within the game was an incredible feeling. There was no helping hand from the greater universe or anything like that. Every struggle was yours to carry, and every victory was entirely earned by you. Traversing this incredible world and finding your own meaning amidst a dying, indifferent world just felt so real in a way I really resonated with, and has kind of put Dark Souls 1 in this pantheon of art for me that I will cherish for the rest of my life. I don't know why Dark Souls 1 was the game that made me feel this way. It is what it is. And now that we get my biases aside, there are clear shortcomings to acknowledge with Dark Souls 1. Although I don't even feel like talking about it because in the good year of 2024, people still won't shut the fuck up about these flaws, to the point where it unfortunately feels like any discussion revolving around Dark Souls 1 just boils down to the second half of the game. That kind of just is the game's reputation nowadays. You could just completely unrelated be having a fucking burger somewhere and be like, oh man, this burger's really good. And somehow, some way, these dumb motherfuckers will be like, oh yeah, it's way better than the second half of Dark Souls 1. Have you seen Bed of Chaos, bro? What the The second half isn't even as awful as people say. Yeah, Lost Izalith is shit. Tomb of the Giant sucks. But Grand Archives are really cool, I still think, and New Londo still has that interconnected level design that people say is completely gone in the second half. Y'all are being so hyperbolic about this shit. Okay, I'm being a fanboy. I'm actually doing tricks on it, I know. The second half is still, for the most part, not as incredibly tight as that first half is, design-wise. And you can tell it's rushed in many avenues, but I don't mind it nearly as much as some people, so maybe I'm biased, I don't know. Also, banger DLC, of course. That's not very controversial to say. Artorias of the Abyss adds a whole lot to the base game. But TLDR, Dark Souls 1 clearly means a lot to me. It has major flaws, but it's kind of the thing where I love it so much that those flaws don't really detract that much. And it's no doubt gonna go down as one of the most, if not the most important video game of its generation. S tier, it's a masterpiece. Now, Dark Souls 2. I've noticed recently that there's been a bit of a push among Dark Souls 2 enthusiasts, a bit of a revisionist history, a bit of, dare I say, propaganda. I don't know when or how all this started, but let me state the record, as a person with the correct opinions on everything, that this is still the same dumbass game that it was all those years ago. Now, I have an old unlisted video detailing my many grievances with Dark Souls 2 in terms of mechanics, design philosophy, and basically everything in between. However, the reason that this video is unlisted is because it's shit. It was edited on my phone by me in high school, and it's mad embarrassing. I might link it in the description if you want to hear my thoughts in more detail, but TLDR, I think it's a pretty drastic drop-off in quality from its predecessors. Not the most extreme drop-off ever, but it's notable enough. The game controls awkwardly, the level design is really boring, the enemy placements are dog shit, and a lot of the worst mechanics in areas and bosses throughout the series are all in Dark Souls 2, and its peaks don't really make any of those things worth it at all. It all kind of echoes the general sentiment that they wanted to make a game hard instead of having the difficulty be a byproduct of interesting game design, which just leads to it being more frustrating than anything else. Again, I go way more into detail in that horrible, shitty video, but I don't want to just end up repeating what I said there. What I will say though is I used to hate this game a lot more than I actually do today. I still don't think it's a well-designed game, but I kind of find myself going back to it every once in a while for no real reason. Maybe it's because FromSoft games can be distilled into two eras, one that was more focused on the world design and the experimentation, and another that put a lot more emphasis on action. And Dark Souls 2 doesn't really fall into either camp. It's just this weird outlier in the series, a true black sheep. And maybe its oddness makes it weirdly charming to revisit, just off the novelty that it's so different. Now, it's not like Demon Souls, where the uniqueness is a good thing necessarily, but it might add some value for some. I don't know. Maybe I'm just grasping at straws at this point. I just hate the fucking discourse around this game. You either have people saying it's the worst game ever made or the best one, and anyone who disagrees is a scrub that needs to get good and is just regurgitating thoughts that they heard from other people. Both sides are obviously hyperbolic as hell. It's not the worst game ever. Hell, I don't think it's really that much of a bad game at all. I still go back to it and play now and then, but it's still got terrible fucking issues about it. The worst issues and consistently the lowest points in the whole series, I would say. Yeah, Dark Souls 2, it's not the worst game or anything. Honestly, not even that bad compared to its gaming contemporaries at the time. But in comparison to all the other FromSoft games, I'm putting it pretty low. Okay, see, D tier seems a bit harsh. Like, I don't hate it like it's a D tier game overall. But compared to these other games on the list, I don't know where else to put it but the very bottom. Okay, Bloodborne, yay! Now, Bloodborne is probably the fan favorite of the series. It's a lot of people's GOAT. But as I've shown earlier, I'm not above being a contrarian asshole. I'm not afraid of the smoke. I get off to this shit. So with that being said, nah, Bloodborne still kinda got it like that. I can't even lie. Bloodborne's fucking sick. You know, I guess just to be different, I'm actually gonna start with my criticisms of Bloodborne, because I do have a few. First of all, it's stuck on PS4, so performance is a big issue. For the most part, it runs fine, but during boss fights, there are noticeable frame dips in quality, like consistently, which is unfortunate because of how combat-oriented Bloodborne is compared to its predecessors. Now, I feel a bit iffy about the combat in some of these games, but I'll expand on those issues with a later entry. You know, since Bloodborne is kind of trying to distinguish itself from Dark Souls, I'm actually okay with more focus on combat. But focusing on the combat when the only way to play this game legally is on hardware where the frame rate takes huge nosedives pretty consistently is kind of egregious. The other big problem with the combat for me is counter damage, which is just kind of fucking terrible in my opinion. It's by far the worst part of the entire game. Putting more emphasis on combat, then making it so you take twice the damage for mistiming a dodge roll is just dumb. Like, you're incentivized to be more aggressive, and I think it's way too punishing for a single mess up. And when you combine that with the consistent performance issues, it just makes that stupid ass decision so much worse. I'm genuinely kind of confused why they made it that way. It seems like some bullshit they'd put in Dark Souls 2, not a game as good as Bloodborne. It's an artificial difficulty boost, and I genuinely think it's one of the worst and most appalling decisions in a FromSoft game that isn't Dark Souls 2. But it makes certain fights just way more insufferable than they need to be. There's little stuff here and there about quality of life with the lampposts and the healing system. There are definitely issues, but not as big as the other ones in my opinion. Just inconveniences more than anything, really. But with the major flaws out of the way, Bloodborne's kind of amazing. First of all, I mean, Lordran personally is always going to be my GOAT. But Dark Souls 1 does get a lot more linear in 3 of the 4 major areas of the second half. So when it comes to the full experience, Bloodborne probably has the best and most consistent overall world design of any of these games. The game feels incredibly well connected the whole way through. Not to mention the individual level design is phenomenal. Central Yharnam is one of my favorite areas ever because of how many branching paths there are and how many ways in which they connect back to one another. It overlaps in a really cohesive way. For me though, the thing that stands out most for Bloodborne is the art direction. Because holy shit. This is a bit cliche to say, but Bloodborne genuinely feels like you're walking through a painting. Like you're actually just exploring through living, breathing concept art in its fullest form. The art direction is just beyond fully realized, and it's honestly, in my opinion, the best looking FromSoft game. Hell, it's one of the best looking video games, period. This combined with the fantastic level design and overworld design just makes it a joy to go through each and every area. And I appreciate that they really took a quality over quantity approach too. It's probably the shortest base game out of everything here, but it doesn't quite reach the low of like Dark Souls 1 in exchange, and mostly everything feels really well thought out and meticulous. This approach doesn't just apply to the world, but also the trick weapons, which just makes each one feel all the more special and adds so much personality to the game. While it does have things that hold it back for me personally, it's really a testament to the game's quality that in spite of its very glaring issues and annoyances, minor and major, Bloodborne still manages to consistently be a fantastic experience from beginning to end, and actually is one of those few games that kind of lives up to its ridiculous hype. I'm pretty safely just gonna put it straight to A tier. Oh shit. Dark Souls 3. This might make or break the whole video if it hasn't been broken already. To give a bit of context, this was my introduction to the whole series, so nostalgia to an extent is there, I won't lie. The first time I played this game, it completely blew my mind. I never played anything like it at the time, and I was so hooked, and I just played it over and over and over until my main file was New Game Plus 7. Then I made countless new files and just lost so many hours to this game. And I know a lot of people had the same experience with the game that I did, and trust me, I know people love this game. It's a lot of people's favorites, which is interesting because a lot of the veterans used to just be hating on this game. way too much back when it first came out. Now that a bulk of the community got in from 3 or games like 3 that followed, the consensus kind of shifted, which I think is really interesting. I think both receptions towards the game have been pretty hyperbolic because it was never the worst FromSoft game, but it was never close to the best either, in my opinion. I mean, I understand why people love it so much, and that's mostly due to the fact that it's the most consistent FromSoft game beginning to end, which is kind of a double-edged sword in this case. On one hand, the consistency means you never reach the low points of a Lost Izalith or a 5-1. But on the other hand, I think it lacks the ambition to really reach those peaks of something like Anor Londo. 3 is mostly a game that plays it very safe, and as a result it never feels like it's able to find its own identity. When I think of some of my favorite moments in the series, very rarely does Dark Souls 3 stand out in my mind. I'm never really yeah, 3 really excelled in this specific aspect of the game. Some would say it excels in the bosses, but I really couldn't disagree more. I've hinted at it before in this video, but for the most part, I really dislike the action focus that the series would turn towards. I think the older games had pretty weak action because that was never the focus. It didn't want you to feel like an agile badass. It wanted you to feel grounded and as a result have conscious decision making as if you were really there. This is why I really appreciate Demon's Souls' approach to puzzle bosses and having you think of creative solutions to beat bosses outside of brute force. Dark Souls 3 leans a lot more towards a fluid action system, and it's not like the action sucks or it's not fun, but it still adheres to the Souls formula that was not designed with action in mind. As a result, a lot of the game just kind of devolves into an R1 spam, roll spam, heal super quickly, and then rinse and repeat. I'm not saying I want to be playing a Souls game like it's Devil May Cry, but why even focus so heavily on the combat when the game systems are so shallow in that area? Bloodborne kind of started this trend, but it's more forgivable because it was its own thing and it had mechanics designed with that combat focus in mind. Plus, it made up for it with really great world and level design. Dark Souls 3 in comparison just feels way too repetitive. Every boss strategy and encounter feels the exact same as the previous one, and the epic anime second phase transformations just feel kind of tacky after you've seen it for the 30th time. But this repetition isn't limited to the bosses. I could say the same thing for the areas. Almost every area feels like a super linear path to the boss, and the game as a whole just feels streamlined to a fault. It feels too homogeneous with modern game design being about simplicity and ease of use as opposed to the interesting experimental design that made the FromSoft game stand out in the first place. It clearly worked because 3 became a huge hit and it's a lot of people's favorites, but to me it's so content with not trying to do anything risky or unique. And it's not like 3 has any egregious flaws or low points about it, it's just consistently streamlined and watered down so heavily. Funnily enough, I think the Ring City is the clear best part of the game because it actually feels kind of different, and the dying chaos of the world is awesome to explore, and callbacks don't feel uninspired, whereas the rest of the base game just feels repetitive in comparison throughout. I can't really think of a specific thing that makes Dark Souls 3 stand out in the series, but hey, I can't think of a specific thing that makes it awful either, I guess. It's a very inoffensive and repetitive game that plays it safe and does nothing more. It's cool, it's fun, but it feels about as lifeless as the world it takes place in. You know, even with all the negativity I just spouted, C tier still feels pretty harsh. Dark Souls 3 is a good ass game despite not being great in my eyes, you know. And it's right next to Dark Souls 2. You know what, fuck it, I'm gonna just rename these tiers. Okay, S can be S because we all know what S is. It'll be amazing, great, I'll call this good, I'll call this solid, and this will be, okay. Okay, Sekiro. Now, with how much I shit talk the action focus of 3, some of y'all might, raise your eyebrows for what I have to say about Sekiro. I mentioned that 3 adhered too strongly to the Souls formula for the combat to actually excel or feel interesting in any way, but It's very important to note that Sekiro doesn't do this. I actually did not care much for Sekiro at all when I first played it. I went in and got it over with basically. A big part of that game is how it focused on action instead of experimentation or great level design, which is what interests me personally when it comes to these FromSoft games. But I replayed it for the first time a few months ago to kind of get a better grasp on it, and my feelings on it, they kind of changed. I think because I knew what to expect this time, I was able to more fairly judge what Sekiro was trying to go for, as opposed to finding what I wanted out of it. And when I did that, it kinda clicked with me. Sekiro is what Dark Souls 3 wanted to be. Yeah, sure it has a weaker level design, but that was never really the focus. It's like the complete inverse to a game like Demons or Dark Souls 1. Sekiro really doubles down on the action side of things, and because it's not restricted to the FromSoft formula, it's allowed to fully realize its combat system. The fluidity isn't just a simple roll, dodge, heal fest, it's about deflecting and the various counters that the game has, and having the discipline to know which move to do at which time. Since it's allowed to fully realize its action, FromSoft was able to come up with a really unique and fluid system that doesn't feel like any other game. It's like a really cool action rhythm game hybrid, and it doesn't feel unfocused or that it has some sort of identity crisis or is trying to bite off more than it can chew. It knows what it wants to be, and it's able to excel because of that. Since it's doing something new, it also means that the game's over-the-top anime second phases, they don't feel as egregious as they do in other games. It feels more appropriate for what FromSoft is going for. Because of this, despite having more in common with modern games like 3 and Elden Ring, I think of Sekiro more in the camp of Demons or Dark Souls 1 or Bloodborne for having its own identity and vision and being able to realize that vision brilliantly. And much like those games, the difficulty feels earned and purposeful for what the game is going for, which is good because it's also probably the hardest FromSoft game, and it doesn't feel bullshit in any ways that the other games sometimes do. Yeah, Sekiro is pretty awesome. It's fun, it's unique, and it etches its own identity among the FromSoft pantheon. Now, it doesn't feel like it adheres personally to me in the way that some of these other games do, which is why I wouldn't rank it the highest, but I could fully understand why this would be a lot of people's favorite FromSoft game. I think it grew on me a lot, and I can comfortably put Sekiro in the great tier. Now, we're at the home stretch. Brace yourselves, because even with everything I was saying throughout, this might be the craziest part of the whole video. Elden Ring, the final boss. Man, do y'all remember the insane hype leading up to this game? Like a From Software game collabing with George R.R. Martin. We didn't even know shit about it for years. We didn't know if it was real or not, if it would ever exist. And man, that day one launch playthrough was magical. I mean, just the amount of things to explore and the freedom from the start was overwhelming. And the first time you finish Stormvale and get to Liurnia and realize the game is so much bigger than you thought it was, or when you first descend to the underground and realize there's a whole second map, those moments on a first playthrough felt incredible. Some of the most memorable moments of discovery since Dark Souls 1, honestly. Magical is really the best way to describe that first Elden Ring playthrough, but even then, there were a few cracks that were showing, even with the high of a new game experience. And unfortunately, those cracks only worsened by a lot with each subsequent playthrough. I would say Elden Ring's strongest area is in making an open world game feel dense, but a lot of this is also due to some pretty egregious repetition. Back in the day, people would give Dark Souls 1 and 2 so much shit for reusing enemies and bosses. People would say it was lazy and boring, and while that might not even be wrong, Elden Ring does it so much worse than any other FromSoft game. So much value is taken out of each encounter when you eventually fight the same exact boss for like the third or fourth time. But I guess for some reason it's not a problem when Elden Ring does it the worst, it's only a problem with the other games? I'm not trying to insinuate that Elden Ring is a lazy or boring game. It's an incredibly impressive game, but at the same time it feels kinda safe? Now that statement alone probably sounds crazy, but for me, Elden Ring is far from the most ambitious game in the series. In terms of scale it might be, but it kind of feels more like a culmination of everything we expect from Software, which also comes with some drawbacks. I think the boss lineup in Elden Ring isn't that good, to be honest. I mean, I gave Dark Souls 3 some shit for having repetitive, over-the-top anime fights, but Elden Ring just takes it to a whole new fucking level. Every boss has crazy damage and crazy health pool and crazy anime blasts from the fucking heavens themselves after a second phase transformation cutscene. But bro, it gets old for me, I'm sorry. If I call Dark Souls 3 bosses tacky, then Elden Ring bosses are just straight up fucking annoying. I mean, it just feels so self-indulgent after a certain point. Remember when the Souls philosophy was to make a game as interesting or memorable an experience as possible, with difficulty being a byproduct of that? Elden Ring says, fuck that, crank up all the damage and the health pool and the movesets all the way to fucking 11. Like, these would be cool bosses in a damn Hideki Kamiya game. But in this, it just feels tiring. That coupled with the previously mentioned boss spam, plus the amount of gank fights, it honestly has flaws that, more than anything, remind me a lot of Dark Souls 2, which is not great company to be in. Not to mention balance is really bad. Fights either feel way too overtuned in the boss's favor or in your favor, depending on whether you want to play in a certain way. It's unimaginably hard to balance an open world game like this, I'm sure. But this kind of feels like an offset of the game having a really weird case of streamlining. On one hand, something like the Stakes of Marika feel like great additions for the type of game that Elden Ring is. But then, something like Mimic Tier exists. You can choose to either make the experience feel like an annoying mess or a completely trivialized breeze based on what you decide to use. Either way, it just does not feel that well thought out or finished. And you could say this rewards experimentation, but it feels to me more like the game's balance just being so undercooked. Not to mention New Game Plus just sucks all of the magic out. It feels like the worst From Software game to replay. Plus the balance in New Game Plus is just, it's a joke, you know, you just shred through everything without any thought. Elden Ring feels to me like a good first outing for this kind of game by FromSoft. It does a lot of things right, mainly in interesting exploration, which a lot of open world games really struggle with, but even then it loses a lot of the steam once you approach the late game. And so much of the game, even from early on, feels very half-baked. I just struggle to bring myself to call this an all-time great game, when it feels like it could be so much better. There's so much more potential that Elden Ring has, but its ambition feels totally held back by its insanely annoying self-indulgence. I could keep yapping, but I feel like I'd just be making the same points over and over again and feel as repetitive as the game itself. I'm putting Elden Ring in the good tier. It's a good game, but it's not quite great to me. And that's it. That's the tier list. Okay, if you want to send a pipe bomb to my mailbox after this, I would understand. But if you don't know how to make a bomb, you could just leave me a comment, you know, letting me know that I'm just ass at all of these games. Maybe I'll do future videos on individual aspects of each game, because even with the lower ranking ones, there are things I really appreciate about each one that I may not have been able to fully communicate, because these are just like very generalized thoughts on all of these games. I do plan on being a bit more active. I've got some video ideas, but I'm just kind of lazy and employed, so I have no idea when the hell they'll come out. I definitely want to improve on my 2 videos per year schedule, though. Starting next year. Okay, thank you. That's the video. Check out this cool outro.